Welcome back to the Dota Basics series. In this episode we'll cover skill points, basically one of the resources that you get from leveling up and where to place them to enhance your hero's abilities. Now in the previous Dota Basics episode we talked about how you get skill points, but one thing we didn't have time to mention is that as you level up, every subsequent level takes more experience to gain a level from. So that means that every skill point that you place in the early game is really crucial because it'll take longer and longer to get more skill points as the game goes on. So when deciding where to put your skill points, you first need to compare your skills with each other. Your first question should be, what does the ability do and do I need that now or soon? For example, Magic Missile on Vengeful Spirit launches a projectile that deals damage to an enemy and stuns them. Dealing damage is great and stunning enemies is great. It's a no-brainer, useful skill, but there's other things to consider. How much mana does the spell cost? How large is your mana pool? How many magic missiles could you cast before running out of mana? How much damage does it do? And how long does it stun for? These are all relevant questions, and to be honest, we could talk about skill points all day. So the easiest way to decide where to put your skill points is to try to figure out which skills are going to help you get ahead. Because the best way to get ahead is to kill enemy heroes, oftentimes maxing out your damage and disable skills is best. So as a general principle, you should almost always get at least one of these kinds of abilities by level or 2. And oftentimes you would want to max your damage skills out first because those could help you collect farm rapidly and help you kill heroes. So if I want to maximize Magic Missile as soon as possible, I'd level it up when I can at levels 1, 3, 5, and 7. If I look at the scaling, or how much the ability changes with additional skill points, I can see that my first skill point, it deals 100 damage and it's a 1.2 second stun. The next point gives me plus 75 damage, which is less than the first skill point, and it only increases the stun duration by 0.2 seconds, but it lowers the cooldown by 1 second, which lets me use it more often, and it costs 10 more mana to use the skill. So there's mostly positives, but also some negatives, and the second skill point won't deal as much damage as my first. But because we have multiple choices with skill points, you also have to weigh this against your other skills if you're trying to be as strong as possible at each level, which definitely should be your goal. So if I get Magic Missile at level 1, and I get the passive Vengeance Aura at level 2, which increases your right-click damage by 12%, or about 6 damage per attack early game, is it better with your third skill point to get level 2 Magic Missile for plus 75 damage, or a second point in Vengeance Aura for a 6% increase in damage? If I'm focused on burst damage, which is most of the early game, it's pretty easy to say that getting a second Magic Missile level is much better since the aura damage increase would only be about 3 damage per right click, and I'd have to attack a lot of times to reach the same damage output as the Magic Missile. Pretty easy choice. Now similar to Vengeance Aura, most heroes have at least one skill that is pretty useful with just a single skill point, and they won't need to be maxed out until later in the game. Spotting these one-point wonder skills by looking at the scaling of the ability is helpful, because putting too many of your precious early points into one of these abilities is going to mean that you're weaker than you should be. So here's a few skills like that. Crippling Fear on Night Stalker silences opponents and functions the same at all levels other than the silence duration at night. One skill point gives you 5 seconds of silence, and each additional skill point increases the duration by 1 second, or an increase of 20% with the second skill point. Really not that much benefit. Lion's Hex is another example, and it works by hexing his opponent for 2.5 seconds for 125 mana with just the first skill point. Each additional point increases the duration by 0.5 seconds, increases the mana cost by 25 each level, but most importantly lowers the cooldown by 6 seconds each level till it's down to a reasonable 12-second cooldown. Now here's another hero, Shadow Shaman, who has a very similar skill, also called Hex. It sounds the same, but it has some slightly different values. This Hex has a much lower duration at level 1 of 1.25 seconds for 110 mana. However, the cooldown is a relatively low 13 at all levels. Now I'm going to ask you, which Hex do you think is better? If you're new to Dota, it might be hard to realize, but Lion's Hex is much better because the duration per mana and skill point is very high. With just one skill point, you can Hex for 2.5 seconds. You won't be able to cast it very often, but Lion can leave Hex at one point for a long time because it gives really good bang for the buck. For Shadow Shaman, casting a level 1 Hex is very mana expensive and probably won't even give you a huge benefit, so I try not to use it until it's more leveled up. It's important to consider how much benefit you get from each skill point, but it's also important to consider what the end goal of your skill build is. To know that, it helps to be comfortable with the hero you're playing while also knowing what they're strong and weak against. Lina, for example, has many abilities that deal raw magic damage, so it's often best to max those abilities as soon as possible to allow her to burst down heroes because that's what the hero excels at. A cool thing about heroes like Lina is that she has lots of area of effect between her first 2 skills. Area of effect skills that can deal damage in an area are great for leveling up more rapidly, as it lets you blast entire creep waves and damage multiple enemies in a teamfight. Remember that killing creeps gives you gold and experience, so if you put skill points into abilities early in the game that help you collect more experience, those early skill points help you collect more skill points. However, the same thing goes for heroes. If you kill heroes, you gain levels and gold rapidly. Figuring out which balance of this is best for each hero is truly what playing Dota is about, since every hero is unique, and they all change over time with new patches. You could play Alchemist and spend your skill points on his AoE spell Acid Spray that deals damage over time, or you could instead max out Unstable Concoction to increase its damage and stun duration to better help you kill enemy heroes. Either option is a viable playstyle that comes down to what you feel works and what works for you. We haven't covered ultimates very much yet, but for most heroes you can only skill your ultimate at levels 6, 12, and 18, and it's almost always worth it to max your ultimate as soon as possible, since an ultimate gives far more benefit to your hero than another basic skill would. And like we mentioned in the previous episode, at levels 10 and 15 you can delay your regular abilities to grab talents from your tree, or do the opposite and delay the tree for your abilities. Talent trees allow you to shift your hero in pretty different directions because every talent tree level gives you 2 separate options for a bonus. The benefits could be a decision between more damage and more health, or something like movement speed or regeneration. It's up to you to figure out which branch you prefer in each level. Just try to match it with the item build and playstyle that you have in mind. Now, skill builds are probably a little bit overwhelming, and they do take a lot of time to learn, but it's also important to realize that the players you're playing against are probably just as unsure about their skill builds as you are, so if you do make some mistakes, it's not the biggest deal in the world. And as you get into the late game, you really can't put your skills into the wrong things anyways, because you get a huge amount of skill points and eventually everything gets maxed out. So try not to let it stress you out too much, and if it does, you can also follow build ideas such as in-game skill builds, or you can watch some of my videos to get ideas for skill builds as well. Up next in the Dota Basics series, we'll talk a lot about vision, warding, as well as map obstacles. Thanks for watching!